Hello, I'm Russell Brown. Somewhere different this week, the Wellington waterfront. I'm in the capital for the annual conference of SPADA, the Screen Production and Development Association, which represents the movers and shakers of film and TV. And this is the historic Shed 11. So come inside and we'll start the show. Hello and welcome to Media 7, the SPADA special. This program comes to you as part of the annual conference of the Screen Production and Development Association and as part of TVNZ 7's month-long campaign Spotlight on the Economy. We've been in and around the conference in the past 2 days and we're bringing you some of the major talking points of the 2009 event. Later, we'll chat to the Minister of Broadcasting, Jonathan Coleman. But first, we'll have a look at what's on the walls of Shed 11.
Some countries commemorate their leaders grandly. They might erect big statues, stick them on the banknote, or carve them into mountains. But here in New Zealand, we commemorate them small.
This is of the Grey family, so that's Sir George Grey as a very young man.
These little cameos are some of the works that are being taken from Parliament for The Cabinet Makers, an exhibition put on by the National Portrait Gallery of New Zealand Prime Ministers.
Our Prime Ministers have always been incredibly mean about spending money on themselves. They've simply had this idea that you couldn't be seen spending the public money on themselves.
And although not grandiose, some of the likenesses have big stories.
It was made in 1906 by a Christchurch man, obviously in admiration of Premier Richard Seddon, and it's made of 860 or 875 separate pieces of native timber, depending on which label you believe.
The reason we have this curious collection for a portrait exhibition is that in New Zealand we have no official tradition of getting oil paintings of our leaders.
We've also had to get objects like embroideries, a couple of plastic items and a scent bottle. We drew the line at some rubber Halloween masks that the warehouse was selling a few years ago of Jenny Shipley and Helen Clark, but this one I think is interesting.
Sassy Daddy.
In fact, the best record we have is in photos, and many of our leaders past have to be represented by these pictures found in this passage in Parliament.
It's I think, an important part of our history. It's a bit of a nuisance when you're trying to put together an exhibition.
Although tricky, it's a project that curator Gavin loves.
You can write about someone's personality and their political beliefs, but until you really see a photograph or a painting, it doesn't quite gel.
In order to see some of these unique remembrances for yourself, head down to Shed 11, Wellington waterfront, between 19 November and the 10th of February.
Simon Pound with that report, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to the John Key action figure. If the idea of a keynote address is to spark debate, then Julie Christie's opening speech to this year's SPADA conference certainly did that. Christie, a local producer who has sold formats around the world and is a board member at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, called for no less than an upending of the broadcast funding system. Instead of a funding philosophy centred on what she described as ethnicity loosely disguised as cultural identity, she called for one focused on export and formats. In short, a shift from the idea of funding public good content to a subsidy for commercial producers making, in her words, shiny floor shows. To discuss that speech and more, I'm joined by South Pacific Pictures CEO John Barnett, founder of Australia's Cordell Jigsaw Group and producer of everything from obs docs to sketch comedy and drama, Nick Murray, and New Zealand On Air CEO Jane Wrightson. Welcome to you all. John, what did you make of Julie Christie's speech?
Well, as always, Julie's got some new ideas and some interesting ideas. And I was on the task force with her, which was looking to increase the economic capability of the industry. So some of the things that she talks about, I think, were important. I'm not sure that she identified all the barriers to entry, and I think also that one of the things that is a truism is the things that work well in New Zealand are the things that we sell best overseas. We have very little history of creating things for other markets without them being road tested and accepted here.
So when it works, you are doing both jobs by definition. You're making something that works for a local audience and then sells.
Yes, but anytime you want to sell something overseas, the first question the buyer asks you is, how did it work in New Zealand? And if you say it didn't, or no one watched it, they move right along.
I suppose she actually was the producer of the one exception to that rule, which was the chair, and she sold that format.
Absolutely, but she started out...
Something like 20 million, she said.
Yeah, she started out with the intention of doing that, of creating a format that she could sell everywhere, and, you know, good luck to her for doing as well as she did. But she would be one of the few people who is capable of that, and also that's in a genre that isn't normally made here and hasn't traditionally been funded here.
It also struck me that she was talking about industry funding for export, and I thought, well, if you want that, then go to NZTE. That's what they do. You know, I wonder whether she was really after broadcast funding.
I think that's a good point. She did focus on New Zealand On Air. Now, New Zealand On Air used to take, I think, 80% of the revenue that we got from overseas sales. They now get 75%, and the producer gets 25%. Would we like 100%? Yes, we would.
What would you settle for?
100. But there are other people in the mix. For instance, the Film Commission only recently has moved to 40% on new productions. Prior to that, some people were lucky to get 10%. So quite a lot of money was tied up there. And the other player in the field is TVNZ. Now they've gone in lengthy negotiations with producers, but the truth is they hold on to a lot of the secondary revenue opportunities. And Julie wasn't going to have a go at them because they're the customer. I'm not having a go at them, I'm just discussing the case.
This is such an old argument though, isn't it? When I first started doing Media Watch on national radio, we talked about this. You know, who gets those back-end rights? Is it ever going to be settled?
No, because as soon as the producer gets some, there'll be other people coming after a share of it as well.
Yeah. Nick Murray, you're new to this argument. You've come in and heard a lot of this for the first time. What did you make of the speech?
Look, I thought it was good to raise some of those issues of commerciality of the industry, because for an industry to be an industry, I think it has to be active and create profits, and that's how we have jobs in our respective industries in each country. I think some of the measurements that the task force seems to have put forward that she says have failed to be achieved, which are based on turnover, are a little bit. That's an unusual system. I think we should be trying to get an industry that's profitable. It's not just about turnover. There are lots of companies that have gone broke that have got a lot of turnover and don't make any money. So it has to be about profit. And then
so how do you get to profit?
Well, the producer needs more back end rights. Maybe there's a different way of setting up a funding model. I know there's discussion in Australia where there are some people lobbying to say that the funding agency should have some of its money taken away and it should be given direct to the broadcasters, so the broadcasters don't have to go through all the rigmarole or the producers don't have to go through the rigmarole of jumping through all the hoops.
We've been there and back, I have to say.
But the other thing, the terms of trade need to be simple. So this, 25, 30%, 40%, whatever. In Australia, if a broadcaster commissions a show and pays for it 100%, they get 50% of the back end. It's a really simple deal, and the producer gets 50%, and it's just a 50-50 split. That to me seems like a fair one. If the broadcaster's not paying for 100% of the budget, I don't think they should have any back end.
What do you think would be the effect of the kind of radical change that she was proposing? I mean, she said, we'll do it for 3 years and see what happens. What do you think would be the effect of that kind of shift?
Well, in some genre, 3 years isn't enough to know whether it's working. I mean, it really is a roll of the dice. In our business, in my business, we'll put something into development. Sometimes it takes longer than 3 years to get up, but we're paying for it ourselves. Any plan that looks at the sustainability, the genuine sustainability of the industry, is a good move. But I think you've got to be careful that you're not doing knee-jerk things. And I worry about the idea that New Zealand should be a place that's just creating shiny floor shows when apparently there aren't that many actually being made here anymore.
Fewer and fewer. Jane Wrightson, back-end rights, you know this argument very well. You know what producers think. Is there any room for movement?
Well, I think there's two things here. One is Julie's speech, which was good and provocative, completely failed to recognise that New Zealand On Air did a major negotiation with SPADA and the producers only last year and settled on a radical new structure, which she didn't acknowledge at all, which in fact means the producer gets 75% of the back end, which in the screen sector is probably worldwide the most generous terms for money. I can quite understand that a producer might argue for 100%, but I need to speak on behalf of the taxpayer, if you like, in that we're enormously happy to fund the shows that are a priority, but if there is money to be made, I do think the taxpayer needs to have a little return on its investment, which we then, of course, plough straight back into new production.
To what extent?
And by the way, and shows that for which we fund less than $200,000, producer has 100% back end. It's a pretty good arrangement.
To what extent are you constrained there? Can you negotiate freely on that, or are you constrained by the Broadcasting Act?
We have the capacity to reach our own arrangements, but of course we consult with the officials and the Minister on the way through. But yeah, the business terms are ours to make. And as I said, in the screen sector worldwide, I'd suspect they're the most generous terms in the world.
Consistency is important too. I mean, you really can't have... there are some producers who say, let me go in and negotiate my share, but I don't think that doesn't work.
No, we tried a little bit of the negotiation in the preceding couple of years. It caused a great deal of confusion and a great deal of angst when producer A found out that they'd got a much worse deal than producer B. New Zealand On Air is a very small organisation, just around a dozen people. That means we have to be really simple on our deals. If we're not simple, then we have to have an army of backroom negotiators, and that's just hopeless because the paying for the negotiators just takes away money you have to invest.
John, how much money are we talking about? I mean, I'm sure people in this room will be quite aware, but for viewers, back-end rights, we're talking about licensing either the program itself or the format. Realistically, how much money is there in it?
Well, there can be quite a lot, as Julie demonstrated with the revenue that she generated on the chair. But for programs, the kind of programs we sell, I mean, look, it is in the millions over the years. And the more of it that we sell, and I mean the whole industry, the better off we all are. But that money goes back into development, and it goes into production, and it goes into new ideas. Julie also made the very pertinent point that on the TE board that she's on, New Zealand's biggest companies get grants to go off and develop things which they then commercialise and sell everywhere, and they don't have to pay any of that back. So the notion that, and she made the point that the biggest companies get money they don't have to pay back, and the smallest companies get money they do have to pay back.
And we would say that in effect our system's not far off that. You know, we might very well happily invest to a large amount in a Series 1. Now, if the producer is business savvy and if they have an idea that sells, then they can take that offshore, and I'm very happy for Series 2, 3 and 4 to be funded elsewhere and for the producer to pocket the lot. You could see us as providing, you know, $1 million or $3 million development funding, if you like, to see whether an idea's got legs.
Nick, we're very focused here on free-to-air television because it's free-to-air that's actually commissioning all the production. You were CEO of the Comedy Channel in Australia, and I get the impression you were able to work with local producers. I mean, there are regulations that stipulate that pay TV has to do that.
Yeah.
So clearly you found it was possible for pay TV to have a productive relationship with producers.
Yeah, the way the regulation structure works in Australia is that pay TV, if it's a drama channel, you have to spend 10% of your commissioning of your acquisition budget on new programs. So you have to commission drama. So that's been really, really useful, and that's a very useful piece of regulation. The fact that kind of regulation doesn't exist here is a really poor lost opportunity. The whole content system in Australia is actually very helpful to the industry without there being actual cash payments from the government. There's content regulation on free-to-air and pay TV. But when I was at the Comedy Channel, my last year there, we commissioned 7 or 8 series. It was, by default, it became the major producer of comedy, and we made more comedy than all the free-to-air networks put together. So it was sort of in a period when free-to-air comedy was going down. But what that did is it created a huge profile for that channel, much bigger than the channel deserved, because we're doing some really fun, interesting stuff with new talent. And the problem with free-to-air at the moment is they're not doing enough stuff with new talent. And in Australia, cable is able to bring some of those people up through the ranks, and it's incredibly valuable, I think, for culturally, and it's really good for the production industry.
Would that help you, John? Yeah, we're talking about a regulation. It's 8% in Australia.
It's 10%. Yeah.
Right.
It would help enormously. And as Nick says, an opportunity was lost. I'm not sure you can roll the carpet back on that any more than you can on the sports rights. I think it is interesting that there are a couple of businesses here who make all their production for offshore. And at a domestic level, the most successful is the Natural History Unit. You know, they make 50 or 60 hours a year. It's all sold offshore. They don't get any New Zealand on air.
No, that's right.
And they do that. And then, of course, you've got the service industry, and you've got Legend of the Seeker and Spartacus, and you've got, you know, companies that actually are getting 15% subsidy from the government because of the scale of it, the large budget screen grant, and that's all made for offshore. But I think it's quite difficult to make a drama here that is going to be automatically for offshore. And, you know, we made New Zealand Idol, and TVNZ, in order to bed Idol in, wanted the US version and possibly the UK version and the Australian version. That all makes sense. You can't sell the New Zealand version anywhere. You can't sell it because it's of no interest to anybody else, and also you can't clear the music rights. So the theory of what Julie talks about runs into the practicality of the problems.
Yeah, no one really wants to buy a New Zealand Idol.
No.
Nick, I warned you I'd ask you this in John's presence. John actually has walked the walk, and he's made the program for a local audience that turns out to have an export market in Outrageous Fortune. What did he get right there? Why did that work?
Well, Outrageous Fortune, well, it's titillating for a start, and so it...
I couldn't believe it. It was screening in Singapore when I was there.
Really?
Yes.
Was there much left in there? It's just an interstitial in Singapore. Look, you know, so it's titillating. So, you know, as a late night show in Australia, it works really well, and people talk about it, and you know, it's getting away with things which we're not used to seeing on television. So it's creating talking points, and it's a unique setting. And so, you know, in Australia we get the New Zealand version, and then I understand you've sold the format to other parts of the world as well. Yep. So it's being made in other, you know, fresh in other countries. So that's a great success to have a drama that's being made in this region, that's being sold as a tape format, and you know, the actual show's being sold, and the concept and the scripts are being sold. That's sensational. But I think it's partly the setting. I mean, it's well produced, but the setting is an interesting, unique setting, and we haven't seen that before.
And also, as you said, it's a bit titillating and edgy. Is there a lesson in that? Don't be conservative if you want.
I think every country makes their own conservative, nice, you know, hokey little show. And you know, Sea Change, which is probably the most popular drama in Australia in the last 20 years, huge ratings in Australia. It played here in New Zealand as a secondary sale. I think that was almost the only sale of that all the way around the world. So that's an example of a show that was made for the local audience. The local audience loved it, but no one else wanted it because they all had their version of that show, a lovely, warm, fuzzy, sort of Hamish Macbeth kind of show. So if you do something that's different, that's where the potential is. But you've still got to make the warm, fuzzy, nice things.
It's interesting though, because New Zealand On Air and the broadcasters have both said we don't want cops and docs on prime time, because you can buy all of that made for much bigger budgets with much more familiar faces, so you can get ER and, you know, CSI, and I think that's helped. It's helped us make Outrageous Fortune and Go Girls and The Cult and This Is Not My Life. Those things don't come out of a system where it's Me Too. And I think that's very important.
One last question, and we only have time for a very short answer, Jane. The mood on the floor of the conference appears to be that perhaps in tough times like these, NZ On Air could be a little more flexible about the kind of shows it funds, and maybe actually fund some shiny floor shows, or the kind of commercial TV it normally doesn't. Is there room for flexibility there?
There's always room for flexibility. We strive very hard to have a balance of popular and niche, of peak and off-peak. We fund some very popular primetime shows. We've funded performance shows and talent shows. We're open to discussion.
We'll leave it with that. Thank you to John Barnett, Nick Murray and Jane Wrightson. After the break, the status of the Maori language in the mainstream.